Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring children. The Leaf by Robert F. Young. Teething Ring by James Causey. 0 Hour by Edmond Hamilton. From Beyond the Stars by Leinster. Schizophrenic by Noel M. Loomis. The Leaf by Robert F. Young, originally published in Infinity, March 1958. Narrated by Trussel. He could remember the afternoon as if it were yesterday. It wasn't, of course. Actually, it had been several years back. It had been around the middle of autumn, about the time when the last incarnadine leaves were making their fluttering journeys earthward. He had taken his .22 and gone into the woods where the hickory trees were, and he had settled himself comfortably against the shaggy trunk of one of the hickories, the .22 balanced across his sprawled knees. Then he had waited. The first red squirrel had come out on one of the high limbs and posed there. That was the word, all right. Posed. It had sat there on its haunches with utter immobility, almost as if it had been painted on canvas against a background of leafless naked branches and milk-blue sky. He had raised the .22 lazily and sighted along the slender barrel. There was no hurry. There was all the time in the world. He didn't squeeze the trigger until he had a perfect right between the eyes bead. Then he squeezed it ever so lightly. There was a sharp sound of the report, and then the small body falling swiftly, bouncing and glancing off limbs, tumbling over and over, making a rustling thump in the dry leaves at the tree's base. He hadn't even bothered to go over and examine it. He knew he'd got it right where he'd aimed. They didn't die instantly like that, unless you got them in a vital spot. They thrashed and kicked around after they hit the ground, and sometimes you had to waste another shell on them if the noise bothered you. Of course, if the noise didn't bother you, you could save the shell for the next one, but it was better in the long run to get them right between the eyes, because that way the others wouldn't be frightened away by the thrashing sound, and you didn't have to get up. That had been the first one. The second one had been coming down the trunk of the same tree, spiraling the trunk, the way squirrels do, stopping at frequent intervals and studying their surroundings with a bright BBs of eyes, looking right at you sometimes, but never seeing you unless you moved. This one had stopped, head down, and was looking off to one side when he got it. The force of the bullet striking just below the ear where he'd aimed tore the small red body right off the trunk, spun it around several times, and dropped it into a wild blackberry thicket. He hadn't bothered to look at that one either. He had lit a cigarette and leaned back more comfortably against the hickory. It was a pleasant afternoon, mild for November, a time for wandering in woods, a time to take it a little easy, a time to knock off some of the scavengers and pests you'd neglected during the first days of pheasant and rabbit season, a time to get your eyes down to hairline fineness for the first ecstatic day of deer. Red squirrels were easy, of course, a little beneath the dignity of a true hunter, but when you tried to bore them in vital spots, you got some pretty good practice out of it. He yawned. Then out of the corner of his eye, he caught a red wisp of movement high in the tree to his right. He brought the .22 over casually. He hardly needed to turn his body at all. The stock fitted his shoulder snugly, lay cool against his cheek. There was no recoil, only the sharp ripping sound, and then the dark red body falling, hitting limbs, caroming, dropping, making the familiar, thrilling, rustling sound in the dead leaves. That had been the third. The fourth and the fifth had been about the same. After the fifth, he had become a little bored. He decided to vary the game a little. He drew his knees together and rested the barrel of the 22 in the niche between them, then sat there quietly for a long time. Presently, the sixth squirrel left the security of the trees and made a few quick jumps into the small clearing. Then it stopped and stood poised, a statuette, except for its alive, bright eyes. It was a perfect target, but he was in no hurry. He was enjoying himself immensely. About half a minute, the squirrel moved again, several yards closer, almost in an exact line with the dark little eye of the 22. It sat up on its haunches then, its tail an arched question mark behind it. It put its tiny forepaws together and sat there not moving, almost as though it were praying. That was the part he remembered most vividly. He'd hardly needed to move the 22 at all. The slightest shift had aligned the sights with the imaginary mark between the little eyes. He had squeezed the trigger nonchalantly, and the part of the head just above the eyes had come right off, and the small red body had completed a perfect somersault before dropping into the dead leaves of the clearing. After that, he hadn't bothered with the trees. It was so much more fun in the clearing, waiting for them to come right up to you and pose. Of course, it wasn't such good practice, but it was fine entertainment, an ideal way to spend a lazy afternoon in fall when the wood was all cut for winter, the crops in, the barn roof repaired, and Pa off to town where he couldn't be finding annoying little things for you to do. He had got 11 of them altogether. He hadn't missed a one, and he had felt pretty proud taking them home to show to Ma before feeding them to the dogs. He shifted his cramped legs and peered down through the interstices of the foliage at the grey shape of the hunter. Some of his initial terror had left him when he finally realized that they couldn't see through leaves any more than he could, that they, as well as he, needed an open target in order to make a kill. So he was relatively safe in the tree, for a while at least. Perhaps he could find safety in trees for the rest of his life. Trees might be the answer. He felt a little better. A portion of the fear that had followed the meteor shower was still with him, however. The fear that had detonated in his mind the morning after the shower, when Pa had come running to the barn shouting, "The cities! All the cities have been blowed up! There ain't no more cities in the whole world! Radio just said before it was dead, we're being invaded!" Invaded? Invaded by whom? He hadn't been able to grasp it at first. At first he'd thought Russia, and then he'd thought, no, it couldn't be Russia. Pa had said all the cities in the whole wide world. And then he'd begun to see the people on the road, the terrified people, the walking, running, stumbling people heading for the hills and the forests, the hiding places that ships couldn't see, that bombs couldn't find, but that hunters could. Hunters hunting with incredible silver guns, skimming along the roads to the hills and the forests in fantastic vehicles, alighting by roadsides and lumbering across fields to timber stands, routing out the people from elms and oaks and maples and locusts and even sumac, flushing them out like rabbits and shooting them down in cold blood with blinding shards of bullets. He had run when he'd seen the first vehicle. He'd run wildly for the woods. He'd forgotten Pa and Ma. He'd even forgotten his gun. He'd been scared, crazy scared. What did they want to kill people for? What was wrong with people? He shivered on the limb in the chill morning wind that had sprung up after the first frost of the season. Martians, he'd bet. Martians landing on Earth and wanting everything for themselves, afraid to let people live for fear they'd get some. Greedy Martians, trying to hog the whole world. The grey shape below him moved slightly, and his terror broke out afresh. The hunter appeared to be reclining against the trunk of a nearby tree, its gleaming weapon resting on its huge tentacular legs, waiting. For an irrational moment he considered climbing down and approaching it, getting down on his knees and begging it for mercy. But he'd only be wasting his time. He realized that right away. He knew he'd seen no pity in those cold, inhuman eyes. He knew he'd seen nothing but death. The trees were the only answer. The trees were the friendly screens of foliage, their lofty, leafy hiding places. By living in the trees, a shrewd man might be able to elude the hunters forever, if he was careful, if he never let himself be seen. He peered cautiously down at the hunter again. He looked at the grey patches of the gargantuan body that showed through the interstices of the foliage. As he watched, the first frost-nipped leaf fluttered down past his face, hovering for a moment before his eyes so that he could not miss its new autumnal colouring. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Teething Ring by James Causey, originally published in Galaxy, January 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Half an hour before, while she had been engrossed in the current soap opera and Harry Jr. was screaming in his crib, Melinda would naturally have slammed the front door in the little man's face. However, when the bell rang, she was wearing her new Chinese red housecoat, had just lustered her nails to a blinding scarlet, and Harry Jr. was sleeping like an angel. Yawning, Melinda answered the door, and the little man said, beaming, "Excellent day. I have gewgaws for information." Melinda did not quite recoil. He was perhaps 5 feet tall, with a gleaming hairless scalp and a young old face. He wore a plain grey tunic, and a peddler's tray hung from his thin shoulders. "Don't want any," Melinda stated flatly. "Please." He had great, beseeching amber eyes. "They all say that. I haven't much time. I must be back at the university by noon." "You working your way through college?" He brightened. "Yes, I suppose you could call it that. Alien anthropology major." Melinda softened. The initiations those frats pulled nowadays. Shaving the poor guy's head, eating goldfish. It was criminal. "Well?" she asked grudgingly. "What's in the tray?" "Flanglers," said the little man eagerly. "Oscilloscopes, portable force field generators, a neural distorter." Melinda's face was blank. The little man frowned. "You use them, of course? This is a Class 4 culture." Melinda essayed a weak shrug, and the little man sighed with relief. His eyes fled past her to the blank screen of the TV set. "Ah, a monitor," he smiled. "For a moment I was afraid. May I come in?" Melinda shrugged, opened the door. This might be interesting, like a vacuum cleaner salesman who had cleaned her drapes last week for free. And Kitty Kyle Battle's life wouldn't be on for almost an hour. "My name is Porteous," said the little man with an eager smile. "I'm doing a thematic on Class 4 cultures." He whipped out a stylus, began jotting down notes. The TV set fascinated him. "It's turned off right now," Melinda said. Porteous's eyes widened impossibly. "You mean," he whispered in horror, "that you're exercising Class 5 privileges? This is terribly confusing. I get doors slammed in my face when Class 4s are supposed to have a splendid gregarian quotient. You do have atomic power, don't you?" "Oh, sure," said Melinda uncomfortably. This wasn't going to be much fun. "Space travel?" The little face was intent, sharp. "Well?" Melinda yawned, looking at the blank screen. "They've got Space Patrol, Space Cadet, Tales of Tomorrow." "Excellent! Rocket ships or force fields?" Melinda blinked. "Does your husband own one?" Melinda shook her blonde head helplessly. "What are your economic circumstances?" Melinda took a deep, rasping breath, said, "Listen, mister, is this a demonstration or a quiz program?" "Oh, my excuse. Demonstration, certainly. You will not mind the questions?" "Questions?" There was an ominous glint in Melinda's blue eyes. "Your delightful primitive customs, art forms, personal habits." "Look," Melinda said, crimsoning. "This is a respectable neighbourhood, and I'm not answering any Kinsey report, understand?" The little man nodded, scribbling. "Personal habits are taboo? I so regret. The demonstration." He waved grandly at the tray. "Anti-grav sandals? A portable solar converter. Apologizing for this miserable selection, but on Capella they told me—" He followed Melinda's entranced gaze, selected a tiny green vial. "This is merely a regenerative solution. You appear to have no cuts or bruises." "Oh," said Melinda nastily. "Cures warts, cancer, grows hair, I suppose." Porteous brightened. "Of course! I see you can scan. Amazing!" He scribbled further with his stylus, glanced up, blinked at the obvious scorn on Melinda's face. "Here, try it." "You try it. Now watch him squirm." Porteous hesitated. "Would you like me to grow an extra finger? Hair?" "Grow some hair?" Melinda tried not to smile. The little man unstoppered the vial, poured a shimmering green drop on his wrist, frowning. "Must concentrate," he said. "Thorium-based, suspended solution. Really jolts the endocrines. Complete control, see?" Melinda's jaw dropped. She stared at the tiny tuft of hair which had sprouted on that bare wrist. She was thinking abruptly, unhappily, about the chignon she had bought yesterday. They had let her buy that for $8 when with this stuff she could have a natural one. "How much?" she inquired cautiously. "A half-hour of your time only," said Porteous. Melinda grasped the vial firmly, settled down on the sofa with one leg tucked carefully under her. "Okay, shoot, but nothing personal." Porteous was delighted. He asked a multitude of questions, most of them pointless, some naive, and Melinda dug into her infinitesimal fund of knowledge and gave. The little man scribbled furiously, clucking like a gravid hen. "You mean," he asked in amazement, "that you live in these primitive huts of your own volition?" "It's a GI housing project," Melinda said, ashamed. "Astonishing!" He wrote. "Feudal anachronisms and atomic power side by side. Class 4s periodically rough it in the back-to-nature movements." Harry Jr. chose that moment to begin screaming for his lunch. Porteous sat, trembling. "Is that a security alarm?" "My son," said Melinda despondently, and went into the nursery. Porteous followed, and watched the ululating child with some trepidation. "Newborn?" 18 months, said Melinda stiffly, changing diapers. "He's cutting teeth." Porteous shuddered. "What a pity. Obviously atavistic. Wouldn't the crèche accept him? You shouldn't have to keep him here." "I keep after Harry to get a maid, but he says we can't afford one." "Manifestly insecure," muttered the little man, studying Harry Jr. "Definite paranoid tendencies." "He was 2 weeks premature," volunteered Melinda. "He's real sensitive." "I know just the thing," Porteous said happily. "Here." He dipped into the glittering litter on the tray and handed Harry Jr. a translucent prism. "A neural distorter. We use it to train regressors on Rigel 2. It might be of assistance." Melinda eyed the thing doubtfully. Harry Jr. was peering into the shifting crystal depths with a somewhat strained expression. "Speeds up the neural flow," explained the little man proudly. "Helps tap the unused 80%. The pre-symptomatic memory is unaffected due to automatic cerebral lapse in case of overload. I'm afraid it won't do much more than cube his present IQ, and an intelligent idiot is still an idiot, but—" "How dare you!" Melinda's eyes flashed. "My son is not an idiot. You get out of here this minute, and take your things with you." As she reached for the prism, Harry Jr. squalled. Melinda relented. "Here," she said angrily, fumbling with her purse. "How much are they?" "Medium of exchange?" Porteous rubbed his bald skull. "Oh, I really shouldn't, but it'll make such a wonderful addendum to the chapter of malignant primitives. What is your smallest denomination?" "Is $1 okay?" Melinda was hopeful. Porteous was pleased with a picture of George Washington. He turned the bill over and over in his fingers, at last bowed low and formally, apologized for any taboo violations, and left via the front door. "Crazy fraternities," muttered Melinda, turning on the TV set. Kitty Kyle was dull that morning. At length Melinda used some of the liquid in the green vial on her eyelashes, was quite pleased at the results, and hid the rest in the medicine cabinet. Harry Jr. was a model of docility the rest of that day. While Melinda watched TV and munched chocolates, did and redid her hair, Harry Jr. played quietly with the crystal prism. Toward late afternoon, he crawled over to the bookcase, wrestled down the encyclopedia, and pored through it, gurgling with delight. He definitely, Melinda decided, would make a fine lawyer some day, not a useless putterer like Big Harry, who worked all hours overtime in that damned lab. She scowled as Harry Jr., bored with the encyclopedia, began reaching for one of Big Harry's tomes on nuclear physics. One putterer in the family was enough. But when she tried to take the book away from him, Harry Jr. howled so violently that she let well enough alone. At 6:30, Big Harry called from the lab, with the usual despondent message that he would not be home for supper. Melinda said a few resigned things about cheerless dinners eaten alone, hinted darkly what lonesome wives sometimes did for company, and Harry said he was very sorry, but this might be it, and Melinda hung up on him in a temper. Precisely 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Melinda opened the front door and gaped. This little man could have been Porteous's double, except for the black metallic tunic, the glacial grey eyes. "Mrs. Melinda Adams?" Even the voice was frigid. "Yes, why?" "Major Nord, Galactic Security." The little man bowed. "You were visited early this morning by one Porteous." He spoke the name with a certain disgust. "He left a neural distorter here, correct?" Melinda's nod was tremulous. Major Nord came quietly into the living room, shut the door behind him. "My apologies, madam, for the intrusion. Porteous mistook your world for a Class 4 culture instead of a Class 7. Here." He handed her the crumpled dollar bill. "You may check the serial number. The distorter, please." Melinda shrunk limply onto the sofa. "I don't understand," she said painfully. "Was he a thief?" "He was careless about his spatial coordinates." Major Nord's teeth showed in the faintest of smiles. "He has been corrected. Where is it?" "Now look," said Melinda with some asperity. "That thing's kept Harry Jr. quiet all day. I bought it in good faith, and it's not my fault. Say, have you got a warrant?" "Madam," said the Major with dignity, "I dislike violating local taboos, but must I explain the impact of a neural distorter on a backwater culture? What if your Neanderthal had been given atomic blasters? Where would you have been today? Swinging through trees, no doubt. What if your Hitler had force fields?" He exhaled. "Where is your son?" In the nursery, Harry Jr. was contentedly playing with his blocks. The prism lay glinting in the corner. Major Nord picked it up carefully, scrutinizing Harry Jr. His voice was very soft. "You said he was playing with it?" Some vestigial maternal instinct prompted Melinda to shake her head vigorously. The little man stared hard at Harry Jr., who began whimpering. Trembling, Melinda scooped up Harry Jr. "Is that all you have to do? Run around frightening women and children? Take her oldest daughter and get out. Leave decent people alone." Major Nord frowned. If only he could be sure. He peered stonily at Harry Jr., murmured, "Definite egomania. It doesn't seem to have affected him. Strange." "Do you want me to scream?" Melinda demanded. Major Nord sighed. He bowed to Melinda, went out, closed the door, touched a tiny stud on his tunic, and vanished. "The manners of some people," Melinda said to Harry Jr. She was relieved that the Major had not asked for the green vial. Harry Jr. also looked relieved, although for quite a different reason. Big Harry arrived home a little after 11. There were small worry creases about his mouth and forehead, and the leaden cast of defeat in his eyes. He went into the bedroom, and Melinda sleepily told him about the little man working his way through college by peddling silly goods, and about that rude cop named Nord, and Harry said that it was simply astonishing, and Melinda said, "Harry, you had a drink." "I had 2 drinks," Harry told her owlishly. "You married a failure, dear. Part of the experimental model vaporized. Whoosh! Just like that. On paper it looked so good." Melinda had heard it all before. She asked him to see if Harry Jr. was covered, and Big Harry went unsteadily into the nursery, sat down by his son's crib. "Poor little guy," he mused. "Your old man's a bum, a useless tinker. He thought he could send man to the stars on a string of helium nuclei. Oh, he was smart. Thought of everything. Auxiliary jets to kick off the negative charge, bigger mercury vapor banks, a fine straight thrust of positive alpha particles." He hiccuped, put his face in his hand. "Didn't you ever stop to think that a few air molecules would defocus the stream? Try a vacuum, stupid." Big Harry stood up. "Did you say something, son?" "Gerfel," said Harry Jr. Big Harry reeled into the living room like a somnambulist. He got pencil and paper, began jotting frantic formulae. Presently he called a cab and raced back to the laboratory. Melinda was dreaming about little bald men with diamond-studded trays. They were chasing her. They kept pelting her with rubies and emeralds. All they wanted was to ask questions, but she kept running. Harry Jr. clasped tightly in her arms. Now they were ringing alarm bells. The bells kept ringing, and she groaned, sat up in bed, and seized the telephone. "Darling!" Big Harry's voice shook. "I've got it! More auxiliary shielding plus a vacuum! We'll be rich!" "That's just fine," said Melinda crossly. "You woke the baby." Harry Jr. was sobbing bitterly into his pillow. He was sick with disappointment. Even the most favourable extrapolation showed it would take him 19 years to become master of the world. An eternity. 19 years. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. 0 Hour by Edmond Hamilton, writing as Alexander Blade. Originally published in Imagination, April 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Dad had already gone when Bobby got up. This disappointed Bobby a little, but then he remembered this was the big day. Naturally, Dad would get over to the project early, and at 4 o'clock Bobby shivered deliciously at the thought of it. He ate his breakfast in silence, with Mum across the table drinking a cup of coffee and looking at a fashion catalogue. He was glad she was occupied, because he didn't want to talk. Not today he didn't. Might spill something secret. Might even let out the big secret. That would be terrible. Of course, all things were secret at Buffalo Flats. So secret, top scientists like Dad didn't even discuss them with wives like Mum. And wives like Mum never asked. So it was really something to sit there eating breakfast, knowing that, today, Dad was going to rocket to the moon. And with Mum not even knowing the lunar project was in the works, so naturally not dreaming that he was going with Dad. The thrill was overpowering. Maybe they would have radio communication after they got there, and he would call back and say, "Hello, Mum, guess where I am? On the moon with Dad." And Mum would say, "Why, Bobby, scaring me to death like this. I was looking all over for you," sounding very angry, but not being really angry after all. Because maybe Dad would cut in and say, "Yeah, he's right here with me, dear. What do you think of this boy of ours?" Bobby gulped the last of his cereal so he could go outside and wriggle for joy. And he got up from his chair. Mum said, "And what's your plan for today, young man? Davy Crockett or Buck Rogers?" Bobby had a quick thought, a sudden temptation. Why not give Mum a hint? Why, he could even tell her, and she still wouldn't know. Then later, after he was gone, she would remember back and say, "That boy, when he tells you something, he really means it." Bobby smiled and said, "I think I'll go to the moon today." Mum smiled too, and went back to her fashions. "Well, see to it your fuel mixture is correct." "I'll check it, and Mum, I might not be home for lunch." "Where will you be?" "Oh, I don't know." "Well, mind your manners and say thank you when you leave." Mrs. Kendall, still smiling, watched Bobby dash out into the yard. Living on a restricted government area had one compensation at least. You didn't have to worry about your children. 4 dozen families, all with offspring, trapped behind 10-foot patrolled fence. Here, nobody worried about the children. They came and went, and at noon a mother fed whatever number happened to be in the house at the time. Mrs. Kendall usually drew 6 or 7. It would be a relief to dodge the chore for one Saturday. Out in the backyard, Bobby fussed around his space rocket a little, tightening a screw here, hammering in a nail there, just until he could slip away without Mum noticing his direction. It wasn't a bad rocket at that, he thought. 6 feet long with 2 seats and a keen instrument panel. But kid stuff, of course. After he found the way in through the sewer, he hadn't paid any more attention to his own ship. He could see Mum through the window, back in her book, so he went casually out through the back gate and turned left, kicking at pebbles as he sauntered along and trying to look as though he had no place to go. Had to be careful. Didn't want to bump into any of the other kids today either. The way in through the sewer was at a place behind Laboratory B. There was a kind of an alley there that nobody ever walked through, and then this round lid you could lift up and look under, and a ladder you could climb down. Bobby hadn't dared to go down at first, but after thinking about it overnight, his curiosity won out, and he went back and ducked down into the lower level. He called it a sewer, because of sewers being underground, but this place was clean and had bunches of wires strung in every direction and faint little lights you could see by. Bobby went further and further every trip he took, never telling anybody because you weren't supposed to talk about things at Buffalo Flats, not even to the other kids. Then he found the big drome where they were building the rocket. It was so sleek and beautiful and shiny that he just stared at it, up through the grating in the floor that was for air circulation or something. He didn't know it was the moon rocket at first, not until he had gone back several times to peek up at it, and then one day 2 scientists came walking along right in front of his nose. One of them was Dad. Bobby almost called out, but he caught himself and just listened to them talking. This was the first time his conscience bothered him about going underneath the drome. He thought about it a lot, whether it was the right thing to do, and while he was never able to still his conscience completely, he quieted down by saying he really wasn't doing any harm, because he'd never told anybody what he saw. He learned the rocket was going to the moon by listening to Dad and the other scientists talk when they thought they were alone, and it was funny, because even there they spoke in low voices and didn't give too much away. He had known now for 3 days that at 4 o'clock the roof would open, and the drone would be turned into a blast pit, and the rocket would shoot out through space to the moon. That was all he did know for sure. None of the men had said who was going on the first trip to the moon. Nothing had been said on that subject at all. But Bobby knew Dad would go. He would have to. After all, Dad was the second biggest scientist at Buffalo Flats, second only to Schleimer himself, and Professor Schleimer was very old and certainly wouldn't make the trip. That left Dad. Dad would just have to go in order to run the rocket. There probably wasn't anyone else smart enough in the whole place. The idea of going himself had been born the previous day, when he found a larger grating in the floor near the rocket and realized, if he was very careful, he could climb out of the sewer and duck into the rocket when nobody was looking. Once inside, he was pretty sure he'd find a place to hide until blast-off. All the men would probably be strapped in bunks, but if he found a place he could wedge himself in, he didn't think he'd get hurt. Then, halfway to the moon, he would come out and find Dad, and would he be surprised! At first, thinking about it, he'd been scared, but after he realized how proud Dad and Mum would be, he made up his mind. Now, crouched beside the grating near the ship, he waited while 2 men, technicians in white overalls, walked by. One of them said, "Well, whatever happens, she'll make a big splash." "You said it. Hope the brains know what they're doing." That made Bobby mad. Who said Dad didn't know what he was doing? Dad was just about the smartest scientist in the world. After the 2 men left, he waited a long time. He heard voices, but no one came in sight. Taking a deep breath, he opened the grating and got out. It was only 4 steps to the open port of the rocket. There was a little ramp they'd used to roll things in, and Bobby's feet touched it but lightly as he jumped into the ship. He found himself in some kind of a storeroom. It would be a good place to hide, all right. It was full of aluminium barrels, all the same size. He found a space between 2 rows and sat down and got his breath back. It was very quiet around him. Scary quiet, but he set his lips firmly. He was going to the moon with Dad. John Kendall was a little late that night. He kissed his wife and said, "Well, did you see the big skyrocket?" "How could I miss it, darling? Your supper is in the oven." "I could use a martini first." "Coming right up." While Myra fixed a drink, John lay back in his easy chair and closed his eyes. "We'd hoped to stage a little ceremony at the launching, but Washington said no." "The Russians?" "The Eastern Coalition. It was a race. That's why it had to be so secret. Washington said, 'Light the fuse and fire the thing.'" "Is it still hush-hush?" "No, not between us at least. We fired an explosion rocket at the moon. It will hit in about an hour, and telescopes will show a big purple spot when our explosives go off and throw dye all over the place." Myra handed him a dry martini. "I see. Lots of fun, no doubt, but what's the purpose? 4th of July on the moon?" "Oh, no. If the experiment is a success, the next rocket will carry men instead of a bomb." Myra went to the kitchen to see about supper. John called, "Where's Bobby? In bed, I suppose." Myra didn't hear, and John set his drink down and moved toward the bedroom. Maybe he was still awake. Bobby rolled over. His eyes popped open. "Dad, I thought you went to the—" John Kendall sat down on the edge of the bed and tousled his son's hair. "No, son. It's the old terra firma for me. Did you see the rocket blast?" "Uh-huh. It was really something. It went to the moon, didn't it?" "That's right." Kendall smiled and thought. "Try to keep a secret from the kids. It just can't be done." "How's your moon rocket coming along, son?" "Pretty good. Gee, Dad, as long as you didn't go, I'm glad I didn't go either." "You were planning to make the trip also?" "Uh-huh. I got into the rocket and was all set, but I got to thinking about Mum, how one of us should stay and take care of her in case anything happened." "Smart thinking, son. Now you get to sleep. I'll have a little time tomorrow. We'll play some ball. That will be keen." John Kendall smiled as he left the bedroom. Kids were wonderful. Give them a few old boards and a steering wheel, and they could build a ship to fly to the moon. What a wonderful dream world they lived in. Too bad they had to grow out of it. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. From Beyond the Stars by Murray Leinster, writing as Will F. Jenkins. Originally published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, June 1947. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Tommy Driscoll laid on his stomach in the grass outside his father's laboratory and read his comic books. He was 10 years old, and wholly innocent of any idea that fate or chance or destiny might make use of him to make the comic books come true. He was clad in grubby shorts, with sandals and no socks or blouse. Ants crawled on his legs as he lay on the ground, and he absently scratched them off. To the adult eye, he was merely the son of that Professor Driscoll who taught advanced physics at Harwell College, and in summer vacation puttered around with research. As such, Tommy was inconsiderable from any standpoint except that of fate or chance or destiny. They had use for him. He was, however, wholly and triumphantly a normal small boy. As he scratched thoughtfully and absorbed the pictures in his comic book, he was Space Captain McGee of the rocket cruiser Omadoom, gloriously defeating, for the 15th time since he had acquired the book, the dastardly scheme of the dictator of Pluto to enslave the human race to the green-skinned, stalk-eyed denizens of that dark planet. A little while since, he had been the Star Rover, crimson-cloaked and crimson-masked, and mysteriously endowed with the power to survive unharmed the frigidity and airlessness of interstellar space. As the Star Rover, he had triumphantly smashed the attempt of some very unpleasant Mercurians to wipe out the human race so that they could emigrate to Earth. As both splendid figures, at satisfyingly frequent intervals, Tommy had swung mighty blows at the jaws or midriffs of Mercurians, green-skinned Plutonians, renegade Earthmen, and others. But he had just finished reading both comics 3 times in succession. He heaved a sigh of comfortable mental repletion and rolled over, imagining further splendid if formless adventures with spaceships and ray guns. Locusts whirred monotonously in the maple trees of Harwell College campus. His father's laboratory was a small stone structure off the physics building, and Tommy waited for his father and Professor Wardle to come out. When they did, he would walk home with them and possibly acquire an ice cream cone on the way. With luck, he might wangle another comic. He heard his father's voice, talking to Professor Wardle, who was spending the weekend with them. "There's the setup," said his father inside the laboratory. "Absurd, perhaps, but this Jansky radiation bothers me. I found out one rather startling thing about it." "My dear fellow," Professor Wardle said dryly, "if you publish anything about the Jansky radiation, the newspaper will accuse you of communicating with Mars." Tommy knew by his father's tone that he was grinning. "I've not thought of anything so conservative. Everybody knows that the Jansky radiation comes from the direction of the Milky Way and from beyond the solar system. It makes a hissing noise in a sensitive shortwave receiver. No modulation has ever been detected, but no explanation has been offered either." Professor Wardle moved inside the laboratory. "What's the startling fact you've discovered?" he asked. "It's got a point source," Tommy Driscoll's father said, and Tommy could tell he was still grinning. "It comes from one spot. There's a second-order effect in our atmosphere which has masked it up to now. I can prove it." Tommy chewed on a grass stem. As the son of a professor of physics, he was disillusioned about scientists. They were not like the scientists of the comic books, who were mostly mad geniuses with plans to make themselves emperors of Earth and had to be foiled by Captain McGee or the Star Rover. Tommy knew pessimistically that scientists just took long words, like his father now, but Professor Wardle seemed startled. "A point source? But confound it, man, that would mean it's artificial, not natural, that it was a signal from beyond the stars. What else could it mean?" "I'd like to know myself," said Tommy's father ruefully. "I've checked for interruptions like dots and dashes, and for modulations like our radio. I've made sure it isn't frequency modulated. The only thing left is television." "Therefore the television screen," said Professor Wardle. "I see. You're trying to analyze it with a scanning system. Possible. But if it is a signal from another solar system—" Tommy Driscoll sat up straight, his eyes wide and astonished. His mouth formed itself into a particularly round O. This, of course, was a natural occurrence if fate or chance or destiny was to use him to make the comic books come true. He had been listening with only a fraction of his ears. To a 10-year-old boy, adults do not often seem intelligent. Few of them have any interest in Space Captain McGee or the Star Rover. But Tommy's father was talking about interplanetary communication, of signals from the planets of another sun, from creatures who might be super-intelligent vegetables like the Wangos or the Star Rover had to fight, or immaterial entities like those misty things that almost defeated Captain McGee on the Ghost Planet, because when he swung his mighty fist there wasn't anything solid for him to hit. Tommy's father was talking about things like that. He got up and gazed in the open door of the small laboratory. He regarded the rather messy assemblage of equipment on the workbench with bright-eyed, respectful awe. His father nodded. "Hello, Captain," he said to his son. "No hot wires around? Come in. What's on your mind?" Tommy's eyes shone. You were talking about signals from another planet." "I see," said his father. "Right up your alley, eh? I hadn't realized the popular appeal, but if you'd like to listen—" Tommy fairly quivered with eagerness. His father threw a switch. There was a tiny hum from a loudspeaker, then silence. Then, presently, there was a tiny hissing noise. Just a hissing sound. Nothing else. "That's it, Captain," his father told Tommy. "That's the noise the Jansky radiation makes. When we turn this dial, we tune it out this way," he demonstrated. "And also when we turn the dial that way. Then we tune it back in." He proved it. Nobody has ever explained it, but it comes from outer space. I think it comes from just one spot. Professor Wardle, smoking a pipe and sprawled in a chair, nodded amiably at Tommy. "Yes, sir," Tommy said, thrilled. His throat went dry from excitement. His father threw a second switch. A television screen glowed faintly. "Now it's transferred to the screen," he told Tommy. "But it's still all scrambled. Nothing happens. It's quite a job to unscramble a television signal, even when you know all about the transmitter. If there's a transmitter sending this, I don't know any of its constants." Over Tommy's head, he said to Professor Wardle, "The possible combinations run 10 to the 9th. Professor Wardle nodded. "Lines per inch, size of screen, images per second, possible colours," he grunted. "Then the scanning pattern in possible 3 dimensions and so on. You've got several billion possible variations, all right." "Unscramble it, Dad," said Tommy eagerly. "Please, I want to see what the people look like who's sending it. Do you think we can lick them if they get tough?" "I'm telling you," his father explained, "that I can try several billion ways to unscramble this supposed signal. Even if it can be done, only one of them will be right. It's going to take time." "But, Dad, please try." Tommy was filled with infinite excitement, which, of course, was not only necessary if the comic books were to be made to come true, but was wholly normal small boy. Here was an interstellar signal. He had heard it. Tune the set right, and he would see. Maybe something like the giraffe men who almost killed Captain McGee on the planet of sand, or the frogmen the Star Rover had to fight when a crippled spaceliner was forced to descend on the watery planet Arlith. "I've got to figure out a way to unscramble it, Tommy," his father said. "I've got to calculate the settings that are most likely to show some change on the screen. It's rather like breaking a code. It will take a couple of weeks to compute a series of settings to try, one after the other. Tommy was unconvinced. He argued Space Captain McGee's friend Doc Blandy would simply have whipped out his trusty slide rule and made the computations in seconds. He would push the slide back and forth, set the television controls according to his computations, and say, "On the beam, McGee." And Space Captain McGee would gaze into the television screen and see the worm monsters of Blathock about to chloroform Jenny, Captain McGee's girlfriend, to transfer the brain of a worm monster into her skull. Her body would thereafter house an inveterate enemy to the human race, with specific plans for annihilating it. Tommy argued impassionately. In the end, his father had to resort to authority to stop his arguing. And then Tommy was tempted to revert to his former disillusionment about scientists. But continued belief offered high reward in excitement, so he believed. Still, it was a rebellious small boy who accompanied his father and Professor Wardle home. Even the expected ice cream cone did not console him. He consumed it in an avid gloom. His father tried to comfort him. "After all, we're not sure," he told Tommy. "It might not be a signal at all, or it might be a signal of a type that would seem simple enough to the creatures who sent it, but hopelessly complicated to us. They might be so much farther advanced in science. In any case, it's not a thing to be solved offhand." "But you're going to try, aren't you, Dad?" asked Tommy desperately. "You said it wouldn't do any harm. You said we could lick them. They couldn't harm Earth." "I'll try," his father assured him. "It's simply useless to go it blind. That's all. I'll have my calculations done in a couple of weeks, and you can watch while I try the whole business, all right?" Tommy gulped. He was unable to speak for disappointment. When one is 10 years old, odds of billions to one are negligible. But 2 weeks of waiting is eternity. It is exactly the same as never. And this, too, was not only in the necessary pattern of things in the comic books were to come true, but it was perfectly natural, small boy. That night, Tommy went rebellious to bed the third time he was told. He had hung around his father and Professor Wardle, listening hungrily to every incomprehensible word they said. He was keyed up to enormous excitement. He slept only fitfully. The comics had been a make-believe world in which he believed only with a book in his hand. Now they promised to become real, and he was filled with a monstrous hunger for the adventure they promised. He woke at dawn, and his lurid, fitful dreams had made him ripe for desperate and daring deeds. He slipped into his shorts and sandals and went downstairs. He gulped a huge glass of milk and stuffed down an ample slice of cake. Then he came to a grand and desperate resolution. He slipped out the back door and trudged across the dew-wet campus to his father's laboratory. He wormed unseen into the small building. His heart beat fast. He was scared, but he was Space Captain McGee and the Star Rover all rolled into one, in his own mind, and definitely he was 10-year-old Tommy Driscoll. He remembered, of course, how his father had turned on the shortwave set and the television screen. No small boy could forget those items. He sat down before the controls and threw the 2 switches with a grandly negligent gesture that Captain McGee himself could not have bettered, and then he started, blindly but with infinite confidence, to unscramble the Jansky radiation. He was only one half making believe, and one half deadly earnest, and all absolute faith. Naturally, the odds against any one setting of the controls being the right one to unscramble the Jansky radiation were several billion to 1. But the heroes of comic books always win against odds like that. So did Tommy Driscoll. The comic books were fated to come true. The faintly glowing television screen quite impossibly flickered as he turned the controls. His heart pounded. He worked on, his eyes shining and his head far above the clouds out in interstellar space with Captain McGee and the Star Rover. Presently, quite impossibly, the screen became a steadily pulsating rectangle which at its brightest was very bright indeed. He found a maximum brightness on which he could not improve. He worked other controls at random. One made odd streaks appear on the screen. At the peak of streakiness, Tommy's heart was thumping in his throat. He, Tommy Driscoll, was about to make contact with the people of another planet, circling another distant sun. Another knob suddenly gathered together the shriekings and the pulsations. They made the vaguest of patterns, and then the fuzziest of images. His hand shaking uncontrollably, Tommy Driscoll continued to turn that knob with the slowest possible movements. He had a flash of clearness, and his heart leaped. Then everything was fuzzy again. He turned the knob back, his breath coming in excited pantings. And then, in total defiance of the laws of chance, but in strict obedience to fate and destiny, there was abruptly a perfectly clear picture on the screen. It was not a picture of any place on earth, but of somewhere else, a place so alien in every respect that Tommy would never be able to describe it. And there was a thing looking out of the screen at Tommy Driscoll. His heart did multiple flip-flops, and he shook all over. But it shocked him much less than it would have shocked an adult, because he was wholly familiar with such apparitions from the comic books. This thing looked rather like the people of the planet Meeg, who had tried to wall up Captain McGee in a glass pyramid so he would roast to death when the purple sun rose above the horizon. But also it looked rather like Mr. Schneider, who mowed the lawns on Faculty Row, and it grinned at Tommy. "Hello," he said in a clear treble, which shook uncontrollably with his excitement. "I'm Tommy Driscoll of Earth. We're friendly if you're friendly. We're tough if you're tough. How about it?" That was an exact quotation from the comic book in which Captain McGee had made contact with the people of the system of the 20 Suns, and later had to fight against swarms of spaceships which wanted to capture his star maps so they could find Earth and attack it treacherously without warning. The thing answered Tommy. It didn't use words, of course, but in the comic books, mind-to-mind communication of alien peoples is common enough. Captain McGee had done it more than once, and the Star Rover frequently, wondering more widely than McGee as he did. Tommy knew what the thing was saying, and his piping small boy voice answered in his father's laboratory, and he knew that the thing understood him too. The comic books were specifically coming true. The thing spoke respectfully and cordially, though of course it did not really speak at all. Its people wanted to be friends with Earth, of course. They had been watching Earth with radar for centuries, so it told Tommy jovially. They knew that sooner or later Earthmen would roam the stars and benevolently rule all the planets of all the suns of the galaxy in which Earth is placed, because, of course, Earth has uranium and other heavy metals supplying atomic energy, while other planets are not so fortunate. Tommy's eyes glowed, but he was extraordinarily composed in the heroic calm of children in exciting make-believe. "Oh, sure," said Tommy largely to the thing of outer space. "We're going to have a space patrol that will make all the people on all the planets behave. I'm going to be a captain in it. Maybe we'll come and visit you first of all. How far away are you?" The thing could not tell Tommy in mind-to-mind converse. The thought it had could not be translated into words by Tommy Driscoll's brain, but the distance was very great, and it explained quickly they were able to talk over so vast a chasm as if to face, because of... Again, Tommy's brain was not able to translate the mental impressions he received. He could recognize the meanings the thing wanted to convey if the meanings were stored away in his memory, but naturally, complex technical concepts were simply not in his vocabulary. The thing seemed satisfied to fail. "Have you got spaceships and ray guns and gravity nullifiers and mysterious rays?" asked Tommy eagerly. "Our scientists haven't even made ray guns yet." The thing said that of course its race had such things. It added encouragingly that men would have them soon, of course. With heavy elements, even copper and iron, it would be easy. Then an overtone came into the thoughts that crowded into Tommy's brain from somewhere beyond the stars. Tommy did not notice the overtone at first. It was a feeling of eagerness and triumph, and of a sneering superiority. Tommy got just a momentary impression of its thought of a space patrol subjugating all the galaxy to Earth, and the barest instantaneous flash of hatred because of that thought. But he was too much excited to notice. He was absorbed in his question about ray guns. It said that they were simple. In fact, he would tell him how to make one, and it began simply to explain. A bit of copper wire, twisted just so, and a bit of carbon and a morsel of iron. It urged Tommy to make one immediately. It would guide his hands. The adjustment of the iron and carbon was delicate. Tommy was a small boy, and he sturdily controlled his own hands. In the end, the thing simply told him what to do. He made the contrivance it suggested, putting the wire and iron and carbon together on a bit of board, having salvaged them from his father's supplies. The result did not look too impressive, to be sure. It did not even look like a ray pistol, and that may account for what ultimately happened. Because when it was finished, and Tommy regarded it with a faint and illogical disappointment because it didn't look like Captain McGee's ray pistol, he suddenly felt the eager triumph in the thing which had instructed him. He glanced at the screen, and the thing was looking out of it with a ravening, unguarded hatred in its expression. To Tommy it abruptly looked like the leader of those Mercurians who had wanted to wipe out the human race so they could emigrate to Earth. And suddenly he realized that it hated him and all of humanity with a terrible, burning fury. "Say," said Tommy Driscoll, his small boy's hands clenching and his brows contracting in the best possible imitation of Space Captain McGee. "This don't look so good." His voice wobbled suddenly, and he swallowed. "I'm going to ask my father about this." The thing argued, plausibly, flatteringly, but Tommy felt corrosive hatred behind the ingratiating thoughts. Somehow it reminded him of the dictator of Pluto in one of the comic books he had read only the day before. It asked almost sneeringly if he was afraid. "Scared, no," said Tommy in his clear treble, but with the pretentious grimness of McGee. "I'm just cagey. I'll have my father look this over to see if it's what you say it is." Then the thing raged. Into Tommy's brain there came such menaces, such threats, that his mind reeled. There was authority there too, and at 10 years one is accustomed to obey authority. But there was sudden deep suspicion in Tommy's mind too, and he was fortified by all his knowledge of how the Star Rover and Captain McGee behaved when defying worm monsters and giraffe men and immaterial entities and other non-human races. As the thing raged at him, trying to overwhelm his will with iterated and reiterated commands and threats and sneers and mockery and derision and everything else which should have made Tommy try out his gadget, as the thing raged at him, Tommy fought sturdily, but under a strain which manifested itself as terror, and then panic, and then as hysterical defiance. Which, of course, was essential if the comic books were ordained by fate and destiny to come true. Tommy was white and shaking and terrified when he got home. His family was at breakfast. He went into the dining room on leaden feet and with a whipped, scared look on his chalky white face. It was 9 o'clock. Tommy had slipped away at sunrise. Now he returned, carrying a seemingly crude and seemingly purposeless object in his hand. It was made of copper wire with a bit of carbon and a morsel of iron. "Where have you been?" demanded his father sternly. He didn't call Tommy Captain, which means that Tommy was in disgrace. Tommy looked at his father numbly, who shook all over. "I said, where have you been?" His father repeated. "Your mother and I have been worried." Tommy swallowed. Then suddenly he went all to pieces. He burst into raging tears and flung the contrivance the thing had described into the midst of the breakfast table dishes. That old thing," he sobbed in hysterical fury. "It was in the television screen, and it told me how to make this ray gun, and it told me to turn it on, and I was going to when I remembered that octopus scientist from Centauri who left a note for Captain McGee to make something, and signed it Doc Blandy, and if he'd made it, it would have blown up the whole Earth." His father and mother stared. To have one's small son arrive at the breakfast table in a state of frenzy is upsetting. It is worse when he flings odd objects on the table and shatters a flower vase, while sobbing of impossibilities. What's this?" asked his father, at once startled and uneasy. "What are you talking about, son?" Tommy beat on the table with his fists. He blubbered, but he babbled with the starkly precise articulation of hysteria. His face was utterly white. He was beside himself. I tuned in the set in the laboratory," he cried, in little sobbing bursts of speech. I unscrambled it, and the thing looked at me. It was a thing that hated humans. It told me how to make this, and... Tommy's father went pale himself. He got quickly, and his chair fell over backward. He tried to touch Tommy comfortingly, but Tommy thrust him away. "Too many comic books," said Tommy's father, frightened. "I'll get him to the doctor." I guessed what it wanted," panted Tommy, sobbing. "And it knew that I was thinking, and it got mad. I knew it got mad. It laughed at me and asked me if I was a coward and scared to try the thing I'd made. And I said, 'You old Mercurian, you old Plutonian, you want to blow up Earth.' And I went bang. I smashed that television screen, and I smashed..." Then Tommy buried his head in his mother's lap and howled, and his father and mother looked at each other, white-faced, because they thought his mind had cracked. Even temporarily, it was awful to think about. But then Professor Wardle, breakfasting with them, said very softly, "Great heavens!" He was looking at the contrivance Tommy had made under the thing's instruction. It wasn't quite like anything that anybody on Earth had ever made before, but a scientist looking at it would see more than Tommy could have imagined. Professor Wardle saw aspects that made sense. Then he saw things that he could understand but could not possibly have devised. Then he saw the implications. Look, said Professor Wardle, dry-throated. "It's true. Look what he made. What this thing would do." With shaking hands, he disconnected a wire so it could not possibly be turned on by accident. Then he trembled. Tommy wept himself back to something like composure in his mother's arms. The antics of his father and Professor Wardle helped, of course. They babbled at each other over his contrivance. They looked incredulously at each other. Then they drew diagrams at each other, talking feverishly. Then Tommy's father remembered him. "Captain," said Tommy's father, and there was sweat on his face, "you did a good day's work all right, but please don't do it again without warning me. This contrivance of yours isn't a ray pistol. It's a thing that will start a chain reaction in carbon and iron. If you'd turned it on, all the carbon and iron within its range would have started to act like an atomic pile, and it would have spread, and we couldn't have stopped it. There wouldn't have been any more Earth." Tommy blinked at him, catching his breath from time to time as a small boy will do after desperate weeping. Then his eyes began to shine. "Gee," said Tommy, that thing was trying to destroy Earth, wasn't he? And I stopped him." "He was," said Tommy's father in a very queer voice indeed. "And you did. If a grown-up had been in your place, the trick would have been different, and it probably would have worked." Tommy ceased to catch his breath. He glowed. "I was like Captain McGee," he said breathlessly. Tommy's father swallowed. He needed to hold tightly to his self-control. He, like Professor Wardle, had all the sensations now of a man who had just realized that his life, and that of his family, and that of every other human being on Earth, had hung by a hair for seconds. But he saw, too, that the deadly small contrivance which had not annihilated humanity made use of and so revealed exactly the new principles Earth scientists needed most urgently to know. It would mean atomic engines and power and spaceships and ray guns. They would mean a space patrol to protect Earth against just such creatures that had been foiled by Tommy Driscoll, and that meant— "Yes," said Tommy's father gently, "just like Captain McGee, Tommy. It appears that the comic books are coming true." The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Schizophrenic by Noel M. Loomis. Originally published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, December 1948. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Tommy Basford was concerned over the steady frown on his father's forehead and a little bit hurt because his father hadn't noticed him for at least an hour. At the age of 3, Tommy didn't understand a lot of things, although sometimes he felt them very keenly. Sometimes a person's unpleasant mood would be more painful to him than a spanking. Well, that is to say, an ordinary spanking. He had heard his father say only last night, "It's a chance to make $1 million, if I can trust him, and it won't take but a month," he had said wistfully. "We could move up to the mountains or down to the seashore. You wouldn't have to worry about Tommy getting picked on by the big boys next door, and you wouldn't have to quit playing bridge to come home when you lose your $5. His father had looked at Mother fondly. Then he had sobered. "The only thing is, if Pickens isn't on the level, then we can lose what little business we have just as fast." Tommy thought maybe he could help his father. He gathered up his whole sun energy set from the center of the big front window when he liked best to play. He pulled it across the floor in quantum jerks, moving backward in a sitting position, pushing himself by digging his heels into the floor and then straightening his legs. That way he could make it all in one trip, hugging the sun energy set to his stomach until he jammed his back against his father's chair. He was disappointed that his father did not look down at him and perhaps pat him on the head. It was most unusual. But Tommy set up his blocks and then pressed the button and watched the reaction start all over again. He watched carbon-12 go into nitrogen, and then into oxygen, and then into nitrogen-15. Up to that point it went very well, but when those 4 hydrogen nuclei, represented by 4 glowing green balls, were supposed to combine into one helium nucleus, something went wrong. They didn't combine right. They smacked into each other with a violent report and disappear. At this moment, Tommy's father came to life with a startled jump. He said a word that Tommy, at his age, had never yet dared to say except to himself, because even though he was a prodigy, his mother didn't allow him to say that. He caught it just in time. Tommy was glad, anyway, that his father had quit staring at the paper. Tommy stood up to receive the gentle pat on the head that he usually got from his father's big hand, but as he turned around, astonishingly enough, his father smacked him on the seat, and through his red linen shorts, it stung. "Will you please take those confounded atom blocks in your 170 IQ into the backyard or somewhere so a man can have some peace?" His father tried to sound exasperated, but Tommy didn't think he really meant it. But Tommy got on his knees and gathered the whole set into his stomach and hoped there wasn't any dirt on them to get it on his white waist. Then he went out, very disappointed and even a little hurt. In fact, his eyes felt a little watery, because he thought if Dad would tell him what was the trouble, he could help Dad figure out something. Mother was showing talky Mrs. Jones the new disinstitute that disposed of everything that was waste: soiled clothes, dirty dishes, used silverware. Tommy wondered why they called it silver. Certainly there wasn't any silver in it, as everything was plastic now. Everything, that is, but very special things like his red linen pants. Mother smiled at him vaguely, and Mrs. Jones smiled too, but Mrs. Jones had a sharp, searching look in her eyes that made it seem as if she was trying to find something wrong so she could punish him. Tommy didn't care for her. She wouldn't have any right to send him in to scrub his hands again. "Come here, Tommy," she said in a high, cooing voice, and made a move for him. But Tommy felt a strange, almost violent repugnance toward her. He backed away and went sideward toward the kitchen door. It opened, and he lifted his feet high to get over the sill and very nearly lost his balance doing so. That annoyed him too. Being a prodigy was all right if one had a body to go with it. When a boy had a 10-year-old mind, it was irritating to have a 3-year-old body as clumsy as the body of a baby. He lost an orange-coloured electron just outside of the door, but he let it lie there for a moment. Mrs. Jones was too close to the door. Maybe Mrs. Jones would go back into the front room where Dad was worrying so much. Secretly, Tommy chuckled. Dad didn't like Miss Jones any more than Tommy did. He'd send her home in a hurry. Tommy set up his blocks and got some spare nuclei out of the box and started the reaction going again. It puzzled him a lot why the hydrogen nuclei didn't combine properly. There must have been some unusual influence somewhere. In the 2 days he had had it, he hadn't been able to complete the carbon cycle once. Benny, next door, had a set, and when Benny tried it, it always worked fine. Benny never had lost a nucleus by explosion. Maybe there was something wrong with Tommy's set. He'd get Benny to try it, and maybe Benny would let Tommy try his set. Tommy sat there in the white sand, watching the interlaced orange-glowing orbits of the electrons and the broad green paths of the hydrogen nuclei. The sun was warm on Tommy's back, and the Baltimore orioles were singing in the elm tree almost over his head. Across the high electronic fence he could hear the bigger boys playing ball in Benny's yard. Suddenly, the 4 hydrogen nuclei, flashing at half-light speed in their 4 orbits, went together and disappeared in the usual green flash, with a customary loud report. Tommy was thankful the explosion didn't sound as loud out in the yard as it had in front room under Dad's chair, although secretly Tommy liked it better in the house because of that very fact. The only thing was that Dad wasn't in a very good mood today. Tommy watched the orioles sweeping around the treetop, and the Papa Oriole's orange plumage, flashing in the sunlight, reminded him of the orbit of an electron. Then he remembered that he had dropped an electron just outside the kitchen door. He got up laboriously. He was so solid his legs had a hard time holding him up sometimes. He went to the door and leaned over to pick up the electron. He heard the swish of the door as it opened, and then the high cooing of Mrs. Jones' voice as she bore down on him. "Oh, that dear little boy! I simply must squeeze him!" Tommy stood up suddenly. So suddenly he lost his balance and sat down on the grass. Mrs. Jones reached for him, and that strange feeling of repugnance he had for her grew so powerful that it almost smothered him. He squirmed to get away from her, but he was trapped. She touched him, and his body quit squirming because Mother wouldn't like it. But in his mind he writhed. It almost seemed that he could tear himself away from his body. Then he did. Just how, he didn't know, but suddenly he was standing a couple of feet to one side, watching Mrs. Jones holding the arms of his first body. He looked down at himself. Yes, he was in a body too. He was wearing red linen pants. This body didn't seem quite as solid as his first, but solid enough. He looked up at Mrs. Jones triumphantly. He was surprised to see her drawing back with her mouth open like the hole in the disintertute. Her eyes were sticking out and her eyebrows were almost up to her hair. "Oh, he split!" she shrieked. He's got 2 bodies!" Tommy was very amused at her antics. He looked over and smiled at his mother, but she too was staring at him with something like horror. Then Mrs. Jones did something Tommy couldn't understand. She went to his mother and put her arms around her and cried and said, "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry for you. I didn't know you had this burden. All of us have our crosses to bear. The atomic age has left such dreadful marks on civilization. But, oh, my dear." She let out a hearty bawl, and Tommy quit being amused and began to be very disgusted. She looked at him from under one arm, half afraid, he thought, and then she turned back to Tommy's mother. "My dear, a schizo. Schizophrenic," said Tommy number 1 helpfully. "Split personality," Mrs. Jones sputtered. "But physically! Oh, my Tommy's mother was disengaging herself. "Why don't you go home and make yourself a nice cup of hot tea, with maybe just a touch of—" She hesitated. "Arsenic," Tommy thought promptly. He became one little boy again. "Ah?" She caught herself and looked at Tommy, horrified. "Just a touch of brandy," she said. Mrs. Jones looked bewildered. Oh, this was fun, thought Tommy. He'd known for some time that he could mentally suggest things for his parents to say, but he'd never tried it so openly before. He knew one thing, though. He'd better be plenty careful with this power, or he'd get walloped. In fact, as he thought about it, he didn't feel too sure about the arsenic deal. Mrs. Jones retired in confusion, and Tommy went back to the sun energy set. But when his father and mother were both outside, and mother was saying as if she were shocked, "Yes, he definitely split in two. I saw him with my own eyes." His father looked serious. Then he chuckled. "No doubt you would have done the same thing if you could have, but I wonder why." He took Tommy's arm somewhat gingerly. He took the other arm. "He doesn't do it when we touch him. It must be her repellent personality, or some phase of it. Insincerity, do you suppose?" Tommy himself guessed that was it. Mrs. Jones never said what she meant, and never meant what she said. That was what made Tommy writhe. His mother and father talked it over, and in the end they didn't seem too worried about him. "We'll see," said his father, "what develops." Then his father began to walk around the yard, stretching and sunning like an orange aureole. He finally sat down in the lawn chair, and Tommy's mother sat beside him, and that worried look came back on his father's face. "I wish I knew what to say," he murmured absently. "It might be the chance of a lifetime. The man claims he's got a tube that will make it possible to send television around the earth. It's worth a lot of millions if it works." "Can't you test it?" Dad shook his head. "It would take 25,000 to test it. We'd need a lot of equipment, and you can't take it to any of the big manufacturers because you'd lose it fast as if they discovered it would work. That's where the gamble comes in. I'd have to back it, sight unseen." "There are lots of gyp artists going around," his mother suggested. "Yes, but darn it, Gwyn, once in a while there's a real thing drops in your lap too. Remember Clarence Fisher? He ran into the same kind of deal. A naive fellow from the country somewhere had a new idea for automatic heat control in an electric circuit that did away with contacts. Something brand new. Clarence took a chance, and look at him now. Winters in Florida, summers in Acapulco. No worries about anything. Gosh." Tommy thought he'd rather live in the mountains where he could smell the pine trees. "Can't you check up on Mr. Franklin?" "I've checked. Not really much background. Claims he's been roaming a lot. Could be, too. The whole deal is, I guess, we've got a good little business making ordinary television tubes, and it's a question whether we want to be sure of a decent living or take a chance on a fortune." "Maybe it's better to be safe," said Tommy's mother. Well, Tommy had never seen Dad squirm before, but certainly he was squirming now, mentally that is. Tommy felt sorry for him, but he went ahead making a solar system in the sand because he wanted to hear more. He felt sure he could help Dad if he could find out more about it. "The worst of it is," his dad went on, "if our competitor should get a hold of a tube like this, it might even put us out of business." His mother sighed. "It's a problem," she remarked sadly. It sure is. It all adds up to this. I have nothing against him, although he's not very solid from a standpoint of background. It could be the real thing. Clarence Fisher's was. Maybe I'm just too conservative, too scared." "You've checked the blueprints?" "Yes, and I can't find anything wrong. It looks sound. That's the worst of it." "When do you have to let him know?" "He's coming here at 8 o'clock tonight." Tommy's mother got up from the grass. "Do what you think best, Howard." she went inside. Little Tommy was glad the man was coming at 8 o'clock, so he could be in on it. He didn't have to go to bed until 8:30, and maybe if they got interested he could get by until 9 o'clock by keeping quiet. He got up and went to his dad's chair, but Dad didn't notice him. Dad got up and followed his mother into the house. Tommy went back to gather up his toys. It would soon be time for the sun to go down anyway. He took the sun energy set in his arms, and then he had an idea. He went through the back and over to Benny's. Benny was 4. "Will you try my set and let me try yours?" asked Tommy. Benny looked down from his half a head of tallness. "I guess so." They traded. Benny started up the cycle in Tommy's set. When he was halfway through, Tommy sat down and started Benny's set, but he watched as the 4 hydrogen nuclei of his own set went together and formed a glowing blue helium nucleus. Then he watched Benny's set between his chubby legs. Presently the hydrogen nuclei, swirling in their orbits, ran together, and there was a flash of green light and an explosion. The 4 nuclei disappeared. Tommy felt bad. Benny was indignant. "What's the big idea, making them explode?" he demanded. Tommy didn't understand. "You must have some kind of electricity in you," said Benny, "that makes them explode." Tommy thought about that. Yes, there must be something about him. Maybe the same strange force that enabled him to suggest words to his mother, and that had made it possible this afternoon for him to split. Maybe that did something to the delicately balanced nuclei. "Look," said Tommy, "I owe you 4 hydrogens, but I can't pay now because then I won't have any left. I'll pay you tomorrow. Is that okay?" Benny was dubious at first, but he thought about it and decided that would be all right. Tommy went back home with plenty to think about, so much, in fact, that through dinner he was quite silent as his father and mother worried about Mr. Franklin and his new television tube. Mr. Franklin came promptly at 8, and they all went into the front room as soon as Mother threw the dishes down the chute. Then they had coffee, and Tommy began to worry. Nobody said anything about business for a long time. Tommy went and got his sun energy set and settled himself under the arm of his dad's chair. Then he looked up expectantly for a pat on the head, but instead of that, his father was staring at him. Tommy remembered how the hydrogen nuclei had misbehaved, so he got to his feet again and went for his chlorophyll kit. He set that up and turned on the little artificial sun, and then just watched. It was fun to see the sunlight soak into the green liquid in the test tubes and come out at the bottom as bubbles of carbon dioxide. It was quiet, too. "So you think," his father was saying, "that we should have 50,000 to start with?" "We should have about 25 cash and 25 in reserve," Mr. Franklin said. He was a very handsome man. "How long will it take us to get into production?" "That all depends on you," said Mr. Franklin. "The only thing we have to worry about is getting the germanium. That stuff is scarce, but I think if we take the cash, I know where we can lay hands on a couple of £100. It will take about 10,000 to swing that end of the deal." Just about then, Tommy felt his father was beginning to squirm. "What do you think?" he asked Tommy's mother. She shook her head. "You're the businessman, Howard. That is for you to decide." Mr. Franklin laughed pleasantly. "That is a very wise observation, madam. Too many women try to run their husbands' affairs. I say you are very wise." But Tommy felt something else. His mother was troubled too. Tommy slowed the chlorophyll cycle so he could watch the light reflect from the nitrogen molecules at the bottom. He wondered why his mother was troubled. Tommy frowned. Then Mr. Franklin took some papers from an inside coat pocket. "I have the contract, the way your attorney approved it," he said casually. "We might as well get that part of it settled. You don't need to put up any money till tomorrow." He laughed, and Tommy's ears pricked up. That laugh sounded strange. "I'll take you on faith," Mr. Franklin said, and handed the papers to his father. Mr. Basford frowned and began to read. Tommy got up and stood against one knee. There were a lot of typewritten pages, mostly with whereases and parties of the second part. Tommy squeezed close, looking at Mr. Franklin, but his father didn't put his arms around him. "Go away, Tommy, go play," he said. Tommy was hurt. He stared at Mr. Franklin, and he was puzzled at the strange look in Mr. Franklin's eyes as Mr. Franklin stared at him. Presently, Tommy's father looked up. "I guess that's it," he said. Mr. Franklin was already handing him a pen. It was one of those new eternity pens with a built-in radiant light. Tommy edged closer. His father took it. He laid the papers on the writing arm of the chair and poised the pen for an instant, made a flourish in the air, and started to write. Tommy was bending over to watch the little light. His dad stared at him in that contemplative way and said, "You're jiggling me, Tommy. Why don't you go over and sit on Mr. Franklin's lap while I sign the papers?" Tommy didn't want to sit on Mr. Franklin's lap, but from the look in his dad's eyes he knew it was a command. He turned around. Mr. Franklin was reaching for him. "Here, little man, come here to me," he said. "I'll hold you while your father signs the paper that will make us all millionaires." He reached out to pat Tommy on the head. Tommy wasn't very clear as to what a millionaire was, but he knew one thing. He didn't want Mr. Franklin patting him on the head. He squirmed away toward his dad. Mr. Franklin reached for him surprisingly fast. In fact, his movement was so quick you could hardly see it. Tommy dodged again, and this time he was in a little panic. He felt that same repugnance he had felt for Mrs. Jones. He didn't want Mr. Franklin to touch him. But Mr. Franklin got him by the arm. He held hard, and it hurt, while Mr. Franklin was smiling with a sort of stiff mouth. Now, come and sit on my lap, little man." Tommy tried to twist away. Mr. Franklin held hard. Tommy squirmed. He couldn't get loose from Mr. Franklin's grip. He squirmed harder. He broke free. That is, he projected himself to one side and looked at Mr. Franklin holding what was really his shell. Mr. Franklin was startled, but he didn't hesitate. "Oh, a schizo," he said, and something came into his face that was frightening. He snatched at Tommy's second self with one arm. He caught Tommy by the belt on his red linen pants and pulled the second one toward him. Tommy split again. Now he stood off to one side and watched, a little fearfully. Mr. Franklin was getting pretty angry. But Tommy's father spoke up. "Why not just let him go?" he said, and the way he said it, it was a command that he expected to be obeyed. Mr. Franklin looked up and slowly turned Tommy loose. Tommy straightened his belt, and his three selves went back together. His father was handing the papers back to Mr. Franklin. "I've changed my mind," he said. "I'll take a chance on being a small businessman." It was rather unpleasant for a few minutes, but Mr. Franklin left with his papers in his pockets. Tommy's father was sitting back in the big chair with a half-smile on his face. "So a phony makes Tommy split, eh?" he chuckled. "Tommy's right. Not that I would blame any man for not particularly caring for children. That's a man's privilege. But I didn't like that ugly gleam in Franklin's eyes when he thought Tommy was going to interfere." Tommy was pretty much unstrung. He sat down under the arm of his father's chair and pressed the button that started the carbon cycle. "I'm glad we found out in time, Howard," said his mother. "But what about Tommy?" She sounded worried. "Do you think—" "It's probably nothing serious, and probably nothing that we can do anything about. If he wants to split when unnice people come around, that's his business. Anyway, he'll probably outgrow it in a few years. Most of them do." Tommy watched the 4 hydrogen nuclei go together, and instinctively he drew back for the explosion. But there wasn't any. The 4 went together into a blue ball that meant a helium nucleus. Tommy clapped his hands. They had worked right this time. Maybe his body energy had been drained by the double split until it didn't affect them anymore. Tommy's mother looked at him softly. Tommy looked back softly. Then he sidled up against his father's leg. His father reached down and caught him around the chest and squeezed him hard. It made Tommy very happy. "Dad," he said, "what's a phony?" The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And don't forget to check out the channel. There's hundreds of stories. Hundreds of stories.